Thanks, Paul, for the introduction, and can I also thank James Fraser. So, America 250, Declaration of Independence. And I did a podcast with James before we came down to this auditorium, and the first question he asked me was, why was there an American Revolution? And that, I'm glad to say, was how I proposed to start this talk, to explain why there was a rebellion. On this side of the Atlantic, we usually refer to what the Americans call the American Revolution as the American War of Independence. So why was there a war between Great Britain and her colonies in North America? Well, to understand the American War of Independence, we have to go back to the war that preceded it, because as so often in history, one war begets another one. And the root causes for this war, which Americans call the American Revolution, lie in the war that we know on this side of the Atlantic as the 7 Years' War, but Americans call the French and Indian Wars. Now, the 7 Years' War had a European theatre. It was also fought in the Far East, in India. It was fought in the Caribbean. North America was one theatre of the 7 Years' War, but arguably it was the most important, because when that war began, France were in possession of what is today the eastern part of Canada. And as a result of that war, which ended in a British victory, that territory, Eastern Canada, became part of the British Empire. And it would go on. I mean, Canada would evolve into a dominion, into the modern Canadian state we know today. Now, it was a war in which British forces were employed on the North American mainland, on the North American continent, both Army, and there was an important Royal Navy contribution to this war. But the war was expensive. It lasted 7 years. As I say, there were a number of theatres. After the war concluded, indeed, very shortly after the war concluded, Britain, or the British government, in the name of the King, George III, sought to recoup some of the losses, financial losses, that had been incurred in that long war. One of the ways they sought to do that, arguably the primary way in which they sought to balance the books, was to increase duties on American goods and also introduce a series of new taxes on the American colonies. Now, Britain thought, the British government, and there were British governments turned over quite a bit in this period, but the view of the British government was that this was perfectly fair. Britain had shouldered the burden of this war, and it was only right that the Americans should now make a contribution. But that's not how the colonists saw it. The colonists believed that they had already made a contribution, because it wasn't just redcoats and the Royal Navy that won this war. This was a war, and the American name for it is the French and Indian Wars. This was also a war in which there was a lot of irregular fighting along the American frontier. You can see the colonies shown in red or pink, salmon maybe is the colour. Those colonies were all involved to some extent or other in that conflict, in raising local militias. But the burden of the fighting done by the colonists themselves was in the southern colonies, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, on their frontiers, where they faced intermittent attacks on isolated settlements by Indian tribes, the allies of the French in this war. So the Americans believed that they had already made a contribution to this war. In fact, their feeling was that without their contribution, Britain would not have secured the significant victory that it did. The British government, British prime ministers of the time, the king, were oblivious to those American arguments, because the arguments are really only articulated after Britain makes these impositions, which the Americans regard as egregious, totally unfair, outrageous. The Americans felt that they were being punished for the sacrifices that they had made in this war. Whereas from the British perspective, and remember we're talking about the 18th century, communication is slow. North American colonies are 3,000 miles away. Correspondence takes at best 6 weeks to pass from one side to the other. So Britain is oblivious to the American sensitivity about these issues. So when Americans start protesting and start organizing, when colonial assemblies begin to debate these matters, it takes the British by surprise. And their attitude is, this is unacceptable. The colonists are ungrateful. Without us, without professional British forces, the colonies might well have been overrun. And France might now hold dominion across the eastern half of the North American continent. So there's no meeting of minds on this. Taxation produces the phrase that I'm sure you're all familiar with, the American clarion call of the time, no taxation without representation. But taxation was only part of the problem, only part of the issue. Arguably, there was one other factor in this alienation of the colonies from the mother country. And it's maybe the most important factor of all. Once the war was over, peace was signed in 1763, Britain wanted to ensure that there was no repeat, that there wasn't going to be another war anytime soon in North America. And they believed that the best way to ensure that there wasn't a war was to keep the colonists where they were, not allow any further migration, as there had been, unofficial migration, from the colonies into the interior. The British government was afraid that if this continued, unchecked, unmonitored, irregular migration into the interior, it would spark an Indian or Native American reaction. And then Britain would be pulled back. British forces would have to go back onto the North American continent. So in 1763, and remember the 7 Years' War only ended in 1763, a decree or a proclamation was issued in the name of the king, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which laid down the restriction. There was to be no further movement of colonials, families, people across the frontier. The interior was to be an Indian reserve, essentially. It was Native American land. The colonists had to stay where they were. But that was like asking the tide to go back, because America and its people was built on movement. How did those colonists get there in the first place? They had to cross 3,000 miles of ocean and all the hazards that went with that in the 18th and 17th centuries. And now they are being told, this is as far as you go, no further. And this was decided in London. This had the King's name attached to it. Americans asked themselves, the colonists asked themselves, what do these people, the people who are making these decisions, know about our lives? What do they know? What does George III know about the frontier? So those two issues, taxation and the proclamation line, set a fuse alight. Now it takes a few years and more twists and turns before we get to the point of shots being fired in anger. There are a lot of incidents that happened in that period from 1763 through to 1775, when the American War of Independence formally begins with the clashes at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. But the problem starts as soon as the 7 Years' War ends. Now, the Royal Proclamation, such was the reaction against it, the Royal Proclamation had to be withdrawn. And it was, because the British government was shaken by the virulence of the American protests. But Britain got no benefit from that U-turn. In fact, quite the reverse. Because the Americans saw the British backtracking, first issuing the proclamation, then withdrawing it, as proof that they had been right all along, that their cause was just, that there shouldn't be these artificial limits imposed on the colonists. And the other lesson that the colonists take from this episode is that if we stand our ground, if we say, no, we're not accepting this, the British government will respond. They're 3,000 miles away. How can they enforce the Royal Proclamation line? And there's a further lesson. If you take the logical line of thought, if the British government have done this once, and even though they've backtracked, they might well do it again when they judge the time right. So the taste, the pleasure of victory in 1763 turned sour very quickly. Ultimately, we're in a downward spiral, which ultimately leads to what became known as the shot heard around the world. The first shot fired in the American War of Independence, or the American Revolution, which is at Lexington. And the shot that is fired is actually fired by the British soldiers, the Redcoats. One of the reasons that we get to this point in 1775, April 1775, from the starting point of 1763, is that as the situation deteriorated and as there were more incidents like the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre, as it was called, when a number of British soldiers were accused of murder, stood trial for murder, and were ultimately acquitted. The interesting sideline to that story of the Boston Massacre and the trial is that the soldiers are defended by John Adams. Future, he's Vice President of the United States and then President. He's a lawyer by profession. So a lot happened in that period, which doesn't concern us directly tonight. Ultimately, it leads to the outbreak of hostilities. And that changes everything. Because as the situation had deteriorated between 1763 and 1775, and one incident seemed to be followed almost immediately by another incident, one of the British responses, or the one that had the biggest impact on the colonists, was sending over large numbers of troops. At the same time as the British were saying that we'll listen to your grievances, it's something we can talk about, we can discuss, we can debate, we can negotiate. But actions always speak louder than words. So while the British government or its representatives in the colonies sounded very, very reasonable, their actions told a different story. Thousands of British troops are sailing across the Atlantic. German mercenaries, a large component of that British force. Well, what are they doing here? The colonists might well have asked, if we're engaged in, reasonable discussions with the British authorities. Well, there's only one answer. That's Britain's final negotiating point. They use force. They use, hopefully it won't come to that from a British point of view. They'd be happy with intimidation doing the job, cowering the Americans. But they misjudged the situation badly. When the shots were fired at Lexington, the Americans, the colonists, had already established a Congress. It was called the Continental Congress. Actually, came together for the first time in the autumn of 1774. And that first Continental Congress sat in session. There were representatives from all the colonies, they're not yet states, to discuss the crisis, because it clearly was a crisis in their relations with Great Britain and Britain's representatives in the colonies, to present a united front, to make or create a common voice for all 13 colonies. That first Continental Congress dissolves itself in the early part of 1775. Before it reassembles, and the reassembled Congress is usually referred to as the Second Continental Congress, we have the outbreak of hostilities, and that hardens the American attitude. But no one's talking about independence, not openly anyway, in 1774 when the Congress first meets, or even in 1775 when Congress reconstitutes itself. The Second Continental Congress comes into being. But as time passes, Lexington and Concord prove that themselves not to have been aberrations, not to have been isolated events, because further battles, further clashes occur, mainly in the north. This is where the war starts, in the north, particularly in Massachusetts. First really big engagement is the Battle of Bunker Hill in Massachusetts. We have another big battle in the Hudson Valley a couple of years later, Saratoga, which is actually a series of battles. So It's events on the battlefield, in the countryside, in the towns, begin to influence, have an impact on the political debate in the Continental Congress. And that's when things start to happen in terms of people talking about independence. And the men that we're talking about, and they were all men, there was no women in the Continental Congress, these were men who did not think of themselves as Americans. It's a convenient term to use from our point of view, or from this perspective in time. Most of them would have regarded themselves as Englishmen in North America. That was their culture, that was their history. Not all of them, but a large number. That changes in the course of the war. On the 12th of April, 1776, the North Carolina Provincial Congress, meeting in Halifax, North Carolina, adopted a resolution that would later become known as the Halifax Resolves. That resolution stated, and I quote, "Resolved, that the delegates for this colony in the Continental Congress be empowered to concur with the delegates of the other colonies in declaring independence." The 83 delegates who were present at that meeting in Halifax, North Carolina, unanimously adopted that resolution, or those resolves. And they now instructed their delegates to the Continental Congress to encourage other colonies to take the same step, to push for independence from Great Britain. The Halifax Resolves are an important event because it's the first official move by colonial political representatives to talk about independence and to support independence. 3 months later, in July, 3 North Carolina delegates, William Hooper, Joseph Hughes, and John Penn, signed the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. That completed the process for North Carolina. But we need to backtrack a bit to see how that process plays out. On the 15th of May, these dates are all 1776, the Virginia Convention instructed its deputies to the Second Continental Congress to offer the motion, quote, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. That motion was tabled in Congress by Richard Henry Lee on the 7th of June. John Adams of Massachusetts seconded the motion. By that time, the Congress had already taken long steps towards severing its ties with Britain. Indeed, it had already denied parliamentary sovereignty over the colonies as early as the 6th of December 1775. And on the 10th of May 1776, Congress advised the colonies to establish governments of their own choice and declared it to be, quote, absolutely irreconcilable to reason and good conscience for the people of these colonies now to take the oaths and affirmations necessary for the support of any government under the Crown of Great Britain. The passage of Lee's resolution was delayed for several reasons. Some of the delegates had not yet received authorization from their own colonies, from their own colonial assemblies, and a few were opposed to taking this final step. Among them, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. Although his argument was a qualified one, he believed that the Congress should first of all establish a central government, a government structure, before declaring independence. However, a committee consisting of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston was promptly chosen on the 11th of June to prepare a statement justifying a decision to assert independence. The Declaration of Independence was written largely by Thomas Jefferson, the tallest figure in this illustration. Jefferson had already displayed talent as a political philosopher and polemicist in a publication of 1774 entitled A Summary View of the Rights of British America. At the request of his fellow committeemen, it was Thomas Jefferson who wrote the first draft. The members of the committee made a handful of semantic changes and somewhat expanded the list of charges against George III. When the draft declaration was presented to a plenary session of Congress, more changes were made, not to the bits of the declaration that you're familiar with. That's Thomas Jefferson's stuff. You couldn't improve that. But it did, for example, the Congress did delete a condemnation that was in the original draft, a condemnation of the British people, because they drew a distinction between the British people and the British government, a distinction that still exists. And they also objected to and deleted from the draft a reference to Scotch and foreign mercenaries, because there were Scots in Congress or Scotch-Irish in Congress. The difference matters to us. We're aware of it. The early Americans, not so much so. And so it goes through the process of being voted on. The key vote is actually taken on the 2nd of July. That's really the date that America declared its independence. But 4th of July was one of the stages it went through. It can be said, as John Adams did say, that the Declaration contained nothing really novel in terms of its political philosophy. There are the signatures. This is James Madison, delegate at the Continental Congress. He's better known, he becomes a Secretary of State and President later, but he's really best known as the principal figure behind the American Constitution, drafted in 1787. His view of the Declaration was, in terms of the motivation behind it, was, and I quote, "The object was to assert, not to discover truth." The American Declaration of Independence puts forward the fundamental doctrine of natural rights, the natural rights of men and women, and the relationship between men and women and government. It was not a perfect document. The list of grievances borders on the very tedious. And yet, for all its defects, The Declaration of Independence was a landmark document. It was, at its core, was an essential morality. If the right of revolution cannot be established on historical grounds, it nevertheless rests solidly on ethical ones. What the Declaration declared, in fact, was the right of the colonists to seek and establish, ultimately, a government of their own choice. Some of the phrases, Thomas Jefferson's phrases, exerted profound influence on the United States, not just at the beginning, but throughout its history. To this day, especially the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," and the rest. Although the meanings of phrases like that have been endlessly debated and conclusions drawn about them, the Declaration of Independence has served to justify the extension of American political and social democracy. And it was an inspiration to people outside the newly declared United States. It encouraged Antonio de Nariño, pictured here, and Francisco Miranda to seek to overthrow the Spanish Empire in South America. And they did in the late 18th and early 19th century. The Declaration, American Declaration of Independence, was quoted by the Marquis de Mirabeau during the French Revolution. But the American Declaration of Independence was not just about Thomas Jefferson, fine though his words are. There are two other influences on this period that make a significant contribution to the outcome, to both the declaring of independence and the winning of independence on the battlefield. The first influence is the Presbyterian influence. The Presbyterian presence in the American colonies grew markedly in the middle decades of the 1700s. And much of that Presbyterian impact, much of the Presbyterian migration to the American colonies originated here. There were Scottish settlers in the New World in the 18th century. But the significant period of Scottish, and therefore Scottish Presbyterian influence comes with migration in the later 18th century, after the American War of Independence, as a result of, but not solely due to, the Highland clearances, the late 18th, early 19th century. There are probably more Scottish serving in the ranks of the British forces than there are Scottish settlers in the American colonies. No, most of the Presbyterians came from the north of Ireland, and they came in significant numbers, in a number of waves, beginning in the second decade of the century, from about 1714 to 18, and then almost every decade after had a wave that usually lasted a few years of Presbyterian emigration to North America, up to the outbreak of the American War of Independence, 1775, which pretty much cuts off, brings to an end emigration for a few years, well, for the duration of the War of Independence. Why did they come? Well, if you look at the waves of immigration, they usually coincide with downturns in the local economy, bad harvests, bad weather, difficulties in the linen trade. The additional problem, or what exacerbated these conditions for Presbyterians was that they were powerless, in contrast to the landlord class, largely Anglican, who also faced the same circumstances, faced the same weather, the periodic famines, economic depressions. But the landlord class always had the option, which they quite often took, of offsetting losses by increasing rents, paid by their Presbyterian tenants. The New World was a magnet to those people. And once the first wave, they are the real pioneers, go out in the second decade of the 18th century, it is their words, it is their letters home that encourage others to follow. And they do, in significant numbers. What's their impact on the American mood at the time that we're focused on, the period after the 7 Years' War? Well, these are immigrants, and this is a common ground between them and the Puritans, who I'm going to come to in a moment, the English Puritans, who settled primarily in New England. Common ground is that neither of these groups, and they are big groups, they constitute a significant proportion of the American population, neither of them have a love for British authority or British governments, because the Presbyterians in particular had a strong sense of grievance that they were encouraged to settle in the north of Ireland, in Ulster, to establish a British bastion here, which they did, and at significant cost to themselves in the course of the 17th century. And how did that government reward them? Well, with the difficulties that they faced in the 18th century. Ulster Presbyterians, like Irish Catholics, were victims of political discrimination. They were subject to the penal laws. So they had no love for British authority. They were, when the circumstances came about that I've already described, there was only one side that they were going to come down on in this dispute. And it wasn't going to be the British side. When the American War of Independence began in 1775, the majority of Presbyterian church leaders supported the rebels. They spoke out in their churches, from their pulpits, in support of the rebellion. There are 56 signatories to the Declaration of Independence. 12 of those 56 were Presbyterian. In percentage terms, that's just over 21%. There was only one clergyman in the Continental Congress. You can guess what denomination he was. I'll give you a clue, he wasn't Anglican. And this is he, John Witherspoon. The Continental Congress had an official chaplain. Guess what denomination he was? This is the man, George Duffield. It's not accidental, it's not coincidental that when this war gets going, and particularly in its later stages, and particularly when the war moves south, that Presbyterian churches are often taken over by British troops and are left damaged, if not destroyed. So British troops were quartered in Presbyterian churches. I have no evidence to suggest that other religious houses were treated in that way. But if you still are in doubt that the Presbyterians were in many ways key to this rebellion or revolution coming about and ultimately succeeding, I call as witness King George III. Because how did he see the American War of Independence or the American Revolution? Well, he summed it up in 2 words. It was a Presbyterian rebellion. And he was the king. One of the interesting points about the Declaration of Independence and the US Continental Congress in general is that not all the participants are American born. And our particular interest is drawn to 3 of the 56 signatories who were actually born here in Ulster. This is James Smith, born in the north of Ireland around 1719. His family fled the landlords of the old world for the freedom or relative freedom of the colony of Pennsylvania. This was around 1727. So he's part of the second wave of migrants that leave these shores, or as he and his family. They settled in the Susquehanna Valley in Chester County. Smith received a classical education from a local minister and continued his studies in the classics, adding land surveying at the Philadelphia Academy, which is now the University of Pennsylvania. He was admitted to the Pennsylvania bar in 1745 and became a prominent man of law and business. At one point, founding an iron manufacturing company, and soon emerging as a leader in Pennsylvania politics. In 1774, this is before Lexington and Concord, Smith helped form and organize support from his colony for the cause of independence. He helped raise a volunteer company of militia. He was appointed to the Pennsylvania Convention that met in Philadelphia in 1775, where he declared, and I quote, "If the British administration should determine by force to effect a submission to the late arbitrary acts of the British Parliament, in such a situation, we hold it our indispensable duty to resist such force and at every hazard to defend the rights and liberties of America," unquote. He was elected to the Second Continental Congress and remained a representative until 1778. He subsequently served a term in the State Assembly and became a judge in the High Court of Appeals. He died on the 11th of July, 1806, in York, Pennsylvania, aged 87. The second of the 3 Ulster-born signatories is George Taylor, born in County Antrim, 1716. Emigrated to Pennsylvania, 1736. His first job was as an iron worker for a man called Samuel Nutt at Coventry Forge near Philadelphia. Samuel Nutt died in 1737, and by 1743, Taylor was managing the iron furnace and had married. His political career began in 1747 when he was commissioned a captain in the Chester County Militia. He also served as a justice of the peace and a judge of the county court. His ironworks, which remained his chief business, became vital during the Revolution, producing grape-shot cannonballs and cannon for the Continental Army. In July 1776, Taylor was one of several men selected as representatives to the Continental Congress to replace members who had refused to sign the Declaration. He appended his signature on the 2nd of August 1776. The following year he was elected to the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, but served only 6 weeks before retiring due to illness. He died 23rd of February 1781. The third of these 3 Ulster-born signatories is Matthew Thornton. We know that he was born in the north of Ireland in 1714, and that at the age of 8, his family, at the age of 3, his family moved to what would become Maine, the state of Maine, in the northeast of America. At the age of 8, his family fled an Indian attack. This was frontier territory, and later settled in Worcester, Massachusetts. Now, Matthew Thornton is cited in some sources as being born in County Londonderry, in the Bann Valley, but he may well have been born in this location. In 1738-39, his father, John Taylor, helped to establish what was called the Lisburn Propriety in Massachusetts, or New Lisburn, as it was also called. John Thornton held a majority share in this tract of land. And the theory is, and I think it's very possible, that because he held the majority share in that land, he had the right to give it its name. And he gave the territory the name Lisburn, Lisburn Propriety. A popular term, in popular terminology, it was called New Lisburn. Why would he have chosen that name? Seems to make sense that he has a connection to Lisburn. The other thing that we know about New Lisburn, this is from a contemporary source, is that it was populated by, quote, such as were inhabitants of the Kingdom of Ireland or their descendants being Protestant, unquote, and that, quote, none be admitted but such as bring good and undeniable credentials or certificates of their being persons of good conversation and of the Presbyterian persuasion, unquote. Thornton was another young man who was well educated, classical education at Worcester Academy, where he studied medicine, and he began a successful practice in Londonderry, New Hampshire. And that Londonderry is Londonderry. There's no dispute about that name. It's the New Hampshire version. This was in 1740, he began his practice. In 1745, he served as a surgeon for the New Hampshire militia during the War of the Austrian Succession, the American theatre of which was known as King George's War. Following the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775, which are the opening clashes in the American War of Independence, Thornton became president of the New Hampshire Provincial Congress. And in that role, he urged citizens to take up arms, citing as justification British cruelty and civilian suffering. He would go on to serve in both the upper and lower houses of the New Hampshire legislature. In September 1776, Matthew Thornton was appointed a delegate to the Continental Congress. He officially took his seat on the 4th of November. And in doing so, he became one of the last signatories of the Declaration. In 1777, he left Congress and resumed his earlier role on the New Hampshire Superior Court. He died in 1803. Another Ulster connection to the Declaration is that it was first printed in Philadelphia by John Dunlap, who came from Strabane, County Tyrone. As a boy, he had been sent to Pennsylvania to work as an apprentice printer with his uncle. And he later took charge of the business. In 1771, John Dunlap founded the Pennsylvania Packet, which would become the first daily newspaper of note in America. A very wealthy man. By the time he slipped the mortal coil, he owned 100,000 acres. So, Presbyterianism and Presbyterians are involved to a significant degree in the War of Independence and in the politics, the revolutionary politics of that time. But there's another strain that finally I want to turn to in studying the Declaration of Independence. And this strain predates Presbyterian links with North America by almost 100 years. And I want to hone in on a particular event at the end of the English Civil War. In October 1647, Parliament had been successful on the battlefield, but the king was still on the throne, and Parliament was negotiating with him. And in these circumstances, it is in this context that a gulf begins to emerge between the army, the men who had fought and died for the parliamentary cause, and Parliament itself. To the extent that in October 1647, this man, Sir Thomas Fairfax, Commander-in-Chief of the Parliamentary Army, or as it was called, the New Model Army, called a meeting of the Army Council to discuss a pamphlet produced by and within the Army rank and file. A pamphlet entitled "The Case of the Army Truly Stated." That pamphlet argued against any compromise settlement with Charles I. The Puritan radicals in the army, mainly a group called the Levellers. It was actually a term of abuse by their opponents because they wanted to level society. They then produced a document in advance of this meeting called the Agreement of the People. This, as I say, was printed and produced before the conference that Thomas Fairfax had called. The Agreement of the People, this is 1647, remember, advanced a radical, even revolutionary political agenda, which included call for equal electoral constituencies, the dissolution of the current Parliament. I'd vote for that one now. Annual elections to Parliament, I wouldn't vote for that. The supremacy of the people, or the principle of popular sovereignty, and the supremacy of a Parliament chosen by the people. The Agreement of the People, this document, then went on to list a further set of principles. Freedom of religious worship. That is freedom of religious worship for all Protestant denominations, not Catholicism. Freedom from military conscription. Indemnity for the actions of the army carried out during the war. The equality of all before the law, and that no law should be passed that is adverse to the safety and well-being of the people. The debates They're known as the Putney debates because that's where the army was camped. And indeed, their first meeting of the conference began in St. Mary's Church in Putney, which is still there and well worth a visit. The chief spokesman for the officers, the Army High Command, is Henry Ireton, Oliver Cromwell's son-in-law. And Cromwell is there too, in support. Although he is called away later, he has other duties to carry out as essentially he's effectively the second in command of the new model army. There are a number of spokesmen for the Levellers, but chief among them is this man, Thomas Rainsborough. Came from a very ordinary background, dockside community in Wapping. On the second day of the debates, proceedings moved from St. Mary's Church to the quartermaster's lodgings. And discussion there focused mainly on the issue of the franchise. In essence, what the Levellers sought was universal male suffrage. And this was argued passionately by Rainsborough and his supporting colleagues. Ireton argued the case for a continued property qualification for voting. And this was backed up by Cromwell, who said that if the poor were allowed to vote, it would lead to the seizure of property and a general descent into anarchy. And then Thomas Rainsborough asked a very pertinent question when that point was made by the Army High Command. What had ordinary soldiers fought for in this war? It was a rhetorical question, which he answered. He said, and I quote, "He hath fought to enslave himself, to give power to men of riches, men of estates, to make himself a perpetual slave." Now, the army leaders conceded that the electoral system could be improved. But there was no agreement on this, how this might be affected. And certainly there was no willingness on the part of Ireton, Cromwell, and the other senior officers to countenance what we would call, and what Thomas Rainsborough was essentially arguing for, popular sovereignty. On the 1st of November, 1647, the discussion focused on the Constitution, what we would call the Constitution, and the radical desire, now voiced by Rainsborough, to abolish the monarchy and the House of Lords. We're still talking about these things. That's how revolutionary these people were. On the 5th of November, in Cromwell's absence, and despite the opposition of Ireton, Rainsborough's proposal was accepted that an official letter be sent from the Army Council to Parliament opposing any further negotiations with the King. That's because these people, Thomas Rainsborough and his like, do not want a king. They do not want a monarchy. Rainsborough has left us these words from the Putney debates. Words that I think have echoed down the decades and which ultimately bore fruit in the American Declaration of Independence. He said this, and I quote, "The poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he. I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent, to put himself under that government. And I do not think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound, in a strict sense, to that government that he hath not had a voice to put himself under. Thomas Jefferson and his colleagues put it this way: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The wording is slightly different, but the spirit and the message is the same. Thomas Rainsborough's poorest he and greatest he are declared by Thomas Jefferson to be created equal. There's no distinction. The American Declaration then asserts that, quote, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, unquote. That is, governments do not give us these inalienable rights. They are created to protect those rights, or as Jefferson says, to secure them. First comes rights, the rights that you are born with. Then comes government. One American philosopher has argued that the single most important word in the American Declaration of Independence is the word secure, because that is what government is there to do: secure your rights. Government doesn't give you your rights, you're born with them. Governments, as the Declaration of Independence states, derive their legitimacy, quote, from the consent of the governed, unquote. Speaking some 129 years earlier, Thomas Rainsborough had made the same point, that only when a man or woman acts, quote, Rainsborough's words, by his own consent, unquote, does a government acquire a valid authority. The American Declaration of Independence is a document of which, or about which, Americans can justifiably feel proud. But its profound and timeless principles were not simply the creation of that one moment in 1776, but were truths that were nurtured many years earlier by English Puritans and Ulster Presbyterians. Thank you.